David Walsh pressed his face against the cold glass of the observation port, his breath fogging the surface in small circles. The communications array hummed behind him, rows of blinking lights casting a soft green glow across the empty monitoring station. His shift had ended 20 minutes ago, but he lingered, watching the asteroid field drift past like slow-moving clouds. The horizon's edge groaned softly, the sound of metal adjusting to temperature changes as they moved through space. David had grown accustomed to these sounds over the past 6 months. Every creak and groan had become familiar, almost comforting in the vast silence of the void. He rubbed his eyes. The double shifts were catching up with him. When Technician Morris had gotten sick 3 weeks ago, David had volunteered to cover the extra hours. The pay bonus would help, and besides, what else was there to do on a mining vessel? Sleep and work were the only two activities that filled their days out here in Sector 7 Gamma. Something moved in his peripheral vision. David turned his head sharply, scanning the darkness beyond the window. Stars stretched endlessly in every direction, their light cold and distant. The asteroid they were currently mining sat 2 kilometers to port, a massive gray rock spinning slowly against the black backdrop. There. Again. His heart rate picked up. About 200 meters from the ship, something pale drifted in the emptiness. David squinted, trying to focus. It looked humanoid, roughly the size of a person, but it glowed with a soft white luminescence that seemed to come from within. "What the hell?" David whispered. The figure hung motionless in space, no suit visible, no tether connecting it to anything. It simply existed there, suspended in vacuum where nothing should be able to survive. The shape was definitely human-like, with what appeared to be arms and legs, though the details were blurred, as if he were looking at it through frosted glass. David's hand shot to the communications panel. He jabbed the emergency alert button, his fingers trembling slightly. "Bridge, this is Walsh in communications. We have an unidentified object outside observation port 3. Possible life form. Requesting immediate visual confirmation." Static crackled for a moment before a tired voice responded. "Walsh, this is Officer Brooks on bridge duty. Did you say life form?" "Affirmative. 200 meters off the port side. It looks like a person, but it's glowing white. No visible suit or equipment. Stand by." David kept his eyes locked on the figure. It hadn't moved since he first spotted it. The glow seemed steady, not pulsing or flickering. He wished he had his personal camera, but it was back in his quarters. His fingers hovered over his tablet, but something stopped him from recording. He just wanted to keep watching, to understand what he was seeing. The communications panel crackled again. "Walsh, I'm showing nothing on external cameras in that sector. Running a full scan now." "It's right there," David insisted. "I'm looking directly at it. Cameras show empty space. Hold on. I'm sending Rodriguez from security to your location." David felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. How could the cameras not see it? He pressed closer to the window, his nose almost touching the glass. The figure remained exactly where it had been, floating motionless. Minutes crawled by. David counted his own heartbeats, feeling them thump against his ribs. The entity, if that was what it was, seemed to be facing the ship. Though it had no visible features that he could make out, he had the distinct impression it was looking back at him. Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor behind him. David didn't turn around, afraid that if he looked away for even a second, the thing would vanish. "Walsh?" A deep voice spoke from the doorway. "Rodriguez, thank God. Look out the window, 2 o'clock, maybe 200 meters out." The security officer moved to stand beside David, his bulky frame blocking some of the light from the monitoring station. Rodriguez was a big man, former military, and David had never seen him rattled by anything. They stood in silence for a moment. "I don't see anything, man," Rodriguez said finally. David pointed, his finger leaving a smudge on the glass. "Right there. The white glowing figure. You can't miss it." Rodriguez leaned in, his face serious now. He stared in the direction David indicated. Seconds passed. Then he straightened up and spoke into his wrist communicator. "Bridge, Rodriguez here. Visual confirmation negative. I repeat, negative visual on any external anomaly." "What?" David turned to look at the security officer. "You're joking. It's right there." Rodriguez met his eyes, and David saw something in that look that made his stomach sink. It was pity. "Walsh, when was the last time you slept? Real sleep, I mean." I'm not hallucinating, David said, turning back to the window. The figure was still there exactly as before. I know what I'm seeing. Nobody's saying you're making it up, Rodriguez said carefully. But you've been pulling double shifts for 3 weeks. The mind does funny things when you're exhausted. I've seen it before on long deployments. David clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, to insist, but what could he say? The cameras saw nothing. Rodriguez saw nothing. Only he could see the pale figure floating in the void. Bridge, this is Rodriguez, the security officer continued. Recommend Walsh complete a medical evaluation before his next shift. Possible fatigue-related perception issues. The word stung. David knew what that meant. They thought he was losing it. Space sickness, some people called it. The psychological breakdown that happened to a small percentage of deep space workers. He had heard the stories, the whispers about crew members who had to be sedated and sent home early. I'm fine, David said, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. Just a precaution, Rodriguez said, his tone softer now. We all need to get checked out sometimes. It's nothing to be ashamed of. David looked back out the window one more time. The white figure remained unchanging, silent, impossible. As he watched, he could have sworn it tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging him. Okay, David said quietly. I'll go see Dr. Grant in the morning. Rodriguez nodded and squeezed his shoulder briefly before leaving. David stood alone in the monitoring station, the hum of the communications array the only sound. He stared at the entity for another 10 minutes, memorizing every detail he could make out through the blur of its form. Finally, exhaustion pulled at him too strongly to resist. He left the station, walking through the dim corridors toward his quarters. Behind him, outside the observation port, the white figure remained suspended in the void, watching the ship with eyeless intent. David didn't see it fade away as he turned the corner. He didn't see it move closer to the hull, passing within meters of the observation port, and he didn't see the way it seemed to study the window, as if trying to understand the barrier that separated them. In his quarters, David lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Sleep would not come easily tonight. He kept seeing that pale form in his mind, burned into his memory like an afterimage. His rational mind told him Rodriguez was right, that he was overtired and seeing things, but his gut, that deep instinctive part of his brain that had kept humans alive for millions of years, told him something different. It told him that what he had seen was real, that something impossible had just happened and that this was only the beginning. The medical bay smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. David sat on the examination table, its paper covering crinkling beneath him as Dr. Olivia Grant shone a small light into his eyes. She was a woman in her mid-40s with gray streaks in her, dark hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had spent too many years dealing with hypochondriacs and people trying to fake injuries to get out of work details. Follow the light, she instructed, moving the beam left and right. David complied, feeling foolish. His head ached from lack of sleep. After returning to his quarters the previous night, he had managed perhaps 2 hours of fitful rest before his alarm pulled him back to consciousness. The entire time he had dreamed of that white figure, floating closer and closer until it pressed against his window like a moth drawn to flame. Pupils responding normally. Dr. Grant muttered, making notes on her tablet. Any headaches, nausea, difficulty concentrating? Just tired, David said. I've been pulling extra shifts. Yes, I saw that in your file. Captain Reynolds asked me to do a full workup. She's concerned about the incident last night. David felt heat rise in his cheeks. By now, the entire crew of 43 people probably knew that Communications Officer Walsh had reported seeing ghosts outside the ship. The mess hall would be buzzing with it during breakfast. I know what I saw, he said quietly. Dr. Grant set down her light and looked at him with that same pitying expression Rodriguez had worn. I'm sure you do. But David, our brains are remarkably good at filling in blanks, especially when we're exhausted. Pattern recognition is a survival trait. Sometimes it fires off when there's nothing actually there. It wasn't a pattern. It was a figure, human-shaped, glowing white just floating out there. And yet the camera saw nothing. Rodriguez saw nothing. She paused. Has anything like this happened before? Any other unusual visual experiences? No, never. She ran him through a battery of tests. Cognitive function, memory, recall, basic motor skills. David answered questions, touched his finger to his nose with his eyes closed, repeated strings of numbers backward. Everything came back normal. Physically, you're fine, Dr. Grant concluded. But I want you to take the next 3 nights off. Proper sleep, no shifts. I'm also prescribing a mild sedative to help you rest. And David? She met his eyes seriously. If you see anything else unusual, I need you to tell me immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to handle it alone. He nodded and took the small packet of pills she offered. As he left the medical bay, he could feel her watching him, probably making additional notes about his mental state. The ship's night cycle was artificial, of course. In space, there was no day or night, only the endless dark punctuated by distant stars. But humans needed rhythm, needed the illusion of Earth's 24-hour cycle to maintain their sanity. The lights in the corridors dimmed at 2200 hours and brightened again at 0600. It was currently 1400 ship time, and David had 8 hours before the next night began. He went to his quarters and tried to sleep. The sedative Dr. Grant had given him sat on his small desk untouched. Something about taking it felt like admitting defeat, like accepting their explanation that he had simply been hallucinating. Instead, he lay in his bunk and forced himself to close his eyes. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless. When he woke, his wall clock showed 22:30. Night cycle had begun while he slept. David sat up, his heart already racing. He knew what he had to do, even though part of him screamed that he should just stay in his quarters and let it go. He pulled on his jumpsuit and left his room. The corridors were nearly empty during night cycle. Most of the crew was either sleeping or in the recreational areas. David walked with purpose toward the observation ports, choosing a different one this time, on the starboard side near the cargo bay. The port was smaller than the one in the communication station, just a circular window about a meter in diameter. David stood before it and waited, watching the darkness beyond. The asteroid field had shifted position as the ship maintained its mining operation. New rocks drifted past, some small as cars, others massive as buildings. Minutes passed. David felt his breathing slow, falling into the rhythm of the ship's life support systems. He counted the seconds, watching for any hint of pale light. Then he saw it. The white figure appeared about 150 meters away, closer than last night. David's breath caught. It was definitely the same entity, the same soft glow, the same humanoid shape, but now he could see more detail. The proportions were slightly wrong, he realized. The arms were a bit too long, the head a bit too large. It reminded him of ancient cave paintings of human figures, recognizable but distorted. "Hello?" David whispered, his breath fogging the glass. The entity didn't move. It simply floated there, suspended in impossible vacuum. David stared at it for a full minute, then looked away deliberately, checking his watch. When he looked back, the figure remained exactly where it had been. He pulled out his personal camera, a small digital unit he used to take pictures of interesting asteroid formations. Aiming it through the window, he snapped several photos of the space where the entity floated. The camera's screen showed only stars and darkness. David lowered the camera and looked with his bare eyes. The figure was still there. "You only show up for direct observation," he muttered. "Why?" As if in response, the entity moved. It was subtle, just a slight tilt of the head, but David saw it clearly. His pulse hammered in his ears. It had reacted to him. Or maybe it had always been moving and he just hadn't noticed before. Footsteps echoed from somewhere down the corridor. David didn't turn around, keeping his eyes locked on the entity. The steps grew louder. "David, what are you doing here?" He recognized the voice. Peter Zhao, the chief engineer and the closest thing David had to a friend on this ship. They had done their training together, spent countless off hours playing cards and complaining about the food. "Pete, I need you to look at something," David said. "Don't say anything, just look. Starboard side, about 150 meters out. Tell me what you see." Peter moved to stand beside him, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He had clearly been working in the engine room. The engineer peered through the window, his face close to the glass. I see space. Couple of asteroids, stars. Look harder. Right there at 2 o'clock. Peter squinted. His eyes moved across the view systematically, the way an engineer examines a schematic. Seconds ticked by. "David, I don't see anything out there." "It's right there," David insisted, pointing. His finger indicated the exact spot where the white figure floated. "It's glowing, humanoid shape, just hanging in space." Peter turned to look at him, concern creasing his face. "Man, I heard about last night." "Are you okay? Maybe you should talk to Dr. Grant again." "I did talk to her. I'm fine. I'm not hallucinating. David turned back to the window. The entity remained visible to him, clear as the hand in front of his face. "Peter, I'm looking right at it. I can see every detail." "David," Peter said gently, "there's nothing there. I promise you. I'm looking at the same space and it's empty." The words hit David like a physical blow. Peter was his friend, someone he trusted completely. If Peter said there was nothing there, he wasn't lying to be kind or to cover something up. He genuinely saw empty space. "Maybe you should get some sleep," Peter continued. "Real sleep." "How long has it been?" "I just slept for 8 hours. Natural sleep." "Or did Dr. Grant give you something?" David didn't answer. He watched the white figure, wondering if he was losing his mind after all. Space psychosis was real. He had read about it in training. Isolation, confined spaces, the constant awareness of the hostile environment just beyond the hull. It did things to people, but this felt different. It felt real in a way that dreams and hallucinations didn't. Peter waited with him for another few minutes, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, he squeezed David's shoulder. "I've got to get back to engineering. Check valve issue in Section 4. But David, seriously, take care of yourself. If you need to talk, come find me." David nodded without looking away from the window. He heard Peter's footsteps retreat down the corridor, leaving him alone again. The entity remained perfectly still, its white glow steady and unchanging. "Why can only I see you?" David asked the empty air. The figure didn't answer, of course. But as David watched, it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it drifted closer to the ship. The distance closed from 150 meters to 100, then to 50. David's heart pounded as it approached. At 20 meters distance, it stopped. David could see more details now. The head was smooth, featureless where a face should be. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a blank expanse of pale, glowing surface. The body was similarly smooth, without clothing or texture. It raised one arm, the movement fluid despite the wrongness of its proportions. The hand, if it could be called that, extended toward the ship, toward David. He pressed his palm against the glass, matching the gesture. They stood like that for a long moment, separated by meters of space and a thin barrier of transparent aluminum. Then the entity pulled back. It retreated into the darkness, its glow fading until David could barely see it. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, leaving only stars. David remained at the window for another hour, but it didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion forced him back to his quarters. He logged into his personal computer and began to search through the ship's database, looking for any reference to similar phenomena. What he found made his blood run cold. Buried in classified sections that he probably shouldn't have access to, but did because of his communications clearance, were reports. Dozens of them. Deep space vessels reporting unexplained sightings. Crew members seeing things that didn't appear on sensors. Most were dismissed as psychological breaks. Some crew members had been permanently grounded, but there were patterns. The sightings happened most often in deep space, far from any planetary bodies. They tended to occur during night cycles, and in every case, only 1 or 2 crew members could see the phenomena, while others saw nothing. David downloaded everything he could onto his personal tablet. Then he did something that could get him court-martialed. He sent an encrypted message to a research contact he had maintained from his university days, a scientist who specialized in exobiology and fringe phenomena. The message was simple. "Have you ever heard of entities visible only to direct human observation? Not showing up on any electronic recording devices." He hit send and sat back. The response would take time. They were so far from any relay station that messages traveled at light speed, which meant days of delay for a response. David looked at the sealed packet of sedatives Dr. Grant had given him. He opened it and shook one pill into his palm, then set it back on the desk. Tomorrow he would take it. Tomorrow he would try to be normal. But tonight he had seen it again, and it had responded to him. That meant something. That meant it was real, no matter what anyone else believed. 3 days passed in a haze of mounting frustration. David followed Dr. Grant's orders, staying away from his regular duties and spending his time in his quarters or the recreational areas. He took the sedatives as prescribed. They helped him sleep, but they also left him groggy and disconnected during his waking hours. Like he was experiencing everything through a thick pane of glass, the entity appeared every night. On the second night, he saw it from the mess hall window during a late snack run. On the third night, It was visible from the gym observation port while he tried to work off his restless energy on a treadmill. Each time it appeared during the ship's night cycle, always at a different location around the vessel, always moving closer to the hull. David documented everything in a private log on his tablet. Times, locations, distances, descriptions of any changes in the entity's appearance or behavior. He was building a case even if he had no idea who he would present it to. On the fourth day, he returned to his communications station for his first shift back. Captain Reynolds met him there, her weathered face showing more concern than anger. "Walsh, how are you feeling?" she asked. "Better, Captain." The rest helped. She studied him for a moment. Reynolds was in her 50s, with steel-gray hair cut short and eyes that had seen 3 previous deep space missions. She had a reputation for being tough but fair. "Dr. Grant cleared you for light duty," she said. "But I need to know if you're really ready to be back. This ship runs on trust, and I need to trust that every member of my crew is operating at full capacity." "I understand, Captain. I'm ready." "Good." She handed him a data pad. "I've reduced your shift schedule. No more doubles until we're certain you're fully recovered. And Walsh, if you see anything unusual, anything at all, you report it through proper channels. That means Dr. Grant first, then me. Clear?" "Clear, Captain." She left him to his work. David settled into his station and began running through the communications logs, checking for any messages that had come in during his absence. The routine work felt good, familiar, grounding. Hours passed. David fell into the rhythm of monitoring subspace channels, logging routine check-ins from mining drones, and maintaining the ship's connection to the distant relay stations that kept them tethered to human civilization. The isolation out here was profound. Their nearest neighboring vessel was 3 weeks away at maximum burn. Earth itself was a 6-month journey that felt more like 6 years when you were living it. At 1900 hours, Peter stopped by the communication station with 2 meal trays from the mess hall. "Thought you might be hungry," the engineer said. Offering 1 tray, David accepted it gratefully. The food was standard fare: reconstituted protein, vitamin-supplemented vegetables, and something that was technically bread. It tasted like cardboard, but it was fuel. "Thanks, Pete." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Peter spoke. "Look, about the other night at the observation port. I didn't mean to make you feel bad. I was just worried. I know. And I appreciate it. Have you seen it again?" David hesitated. This was the moment where he could lie, could pretend everything was fine and normal. But Peter was his friend, and keeping this bottled up was becoming harder each day. "Every night," David admitted quietly. "Different locations around the ship. It's moving in a pattern, circling the habitation modules." Peter set down his fork. "David, that sounds like I'm crazy." "I know how it sounds." David pulled out his tablet and brought up the map he had been creating. "But look at this. I marked every sighting location and time. See, it's systematic. Whatever this thing is, it's not random." Peter studied the map, his engineer's mind processing the data. David had plotted 7 sighting locations over 3 nights, each one marked with a timestamp. The points did form a rough circle around the crew sections of the ship, avoiding the cargo bays and engine rooms. "That's interesting," Peter said slowly. "Even if it's just pattern recognition on your part, you found a pattern. It's not just pattern recognition. The thing is real, Pete. I know no one else can see it, and I know that sounds insane, but I also know what I'm experiencing." "Have you talked to Dr. Grant about this?" "And tell her what? That I'm still seeing things? She'll ground me permanently, or worse, send me back on the next supply ship with a psych evaluation that'll end my career." Peter chewed his lip, thinking, "Okay, let's say hypothetically that something is out there. Something that only you can see, for whatever reason. What would you need to prove it?" David felt a surge of gratitude for his friend. Peter wasn't agreeing with him, but he also wasn't dismissing him outright. "I don't know. That's the problem. It doesn't show up on cameras, sensors don't detect it. I've been going through old reports, and there are other cases like this. Deep space sightings that get classified as psychological breaks." "What kind of reports?" David showed him. Peter read through several of the files, his expression growing more serious. "These are all from different ships, different sectors," Peter noted. "But they have similarities. Single observers, no electronic confirmation, entities that appear humanoid." He looked up. "You know what this reminds me of? Quantum observation problems. The way particles behave differently when observed versus when measured indirectly. You think it's some kind of quantum phenomenon? I think I have no idea what it is." But if we're dealing with something that exists in a state that collapses differently for human observation versus electronic observation, Peter trailed off, shaking his head. That's way beyond my expertise. We'd need a theoretical physicist. We don't have one of those on a mining ship. No, we don't. Peter stood up, gathering their empty trays. But we do have sensor arrays. If this thing is circling the HAB modules like you say, maybe there's some other signature we can detect. EM radiation, gravitational distortion, something that doesn't rely on visual confirmation. Hope flickered in David's chest. You'd help me look? I'm an engineer. I solve problems. Right now you've got a problem. And even if it turns out to be nothing, at least we'll have tried to approach it systematically. He paused at the door. But David, if we find nothing, if there's zero physical evidence anywhere, you have to promise me you'll talk to Dr. Grant again. Deal? Deal. After Peter left, David returned to his work with renewed purpose. At 2300 hours, his shift ended. Instead of going to his quarters, he made his way to one of the smaller observation ports on the lower deck. Near the water reclamation systems, the entity appeared right on schedule. At 0230 ship time, this time it was much closer, perhaps only 30 meters from the hull. David could see its form more clearly than ever before. The smooth, featureless face seemed to tilt down as if looking at different parts of the ship. The arms moved slowly, deliberately, touching nothing but somehow seeming to examine the vessel's exterior. David pulled out his tablet and began taking notes. He measured angles, estimated distances, described every movement. He was so focused that he didn't hear the footsteps behind him until someone spoke. Still seeing ghosts, Walsh? He turned to find Rodriguez standing there, arms crossed over his broad chest. The security officer didn't look mocking, just concerned. I know what you're going to say, David began. Do you? Because I was going to say that I ran a check on those old reports you've been accessing. The classified ones, David's stomach dropped. I have clearance for those files. Technically, yes. But accessing that much classified material raises flags. Captain Reynolds asked me to have a word with you. Rodriguez moved to stand beside him at the window. So talk to me, Walsh. What's really going on? Are you in some kind of trouble? Because if you are, if there's something you're not telling us, now would be the time. I'm not in trouble. I'm trying to understand what I'm seeing. And what are you seeing right now? David looked back out the window. The white entity remained visible, its glowing form clear against the darkness. It had moved even closer while he and Rodriguez were talking, now maybe 20 meters away. It's right there, David said quietly, 20 meters out, slightly below our position. White, glowing humanoid shape. It's been watching the ship. Rodriguez looked. David knew what he was seeing. Empty space, stars, the distant bulk of an asteroid. Nothing more, I want to believe you, Rodriguez said. But you have to understand how this looks. You're exhibiting classic signs of space psychosis. Isolation, stress, lack of sleep, and now you're digging through classified files and seeing things that aren't there. I know how it looks. Dr. Grant is recommending you be taken off active duty. Captain Reynolds is considering it. The words hit David hard. Off active duty meant confined to quarters, possibly sedated, definitely monitored. It meant the end of any chance he had to understand what was happening. Give me 3 more days, David said. Peter Zhao is helping me run sensor sweeps. If we find nothing, no anomalies, no evidence of anything unusual, I'll admit I was wrong. I'll accept whatever Dr. Grant recommends. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. 3 days. But if you exhibit any behavior that suggests you're a danger to yourself or this crew, I won't hesitate to have you confined. Understood? Understood. The security officer left. David remained at the window watching the entity. It had stopped moving, hanging motionless in the void. As he watched, it raised both arms, spreading them wide in a gesture that could have been greeting or warning. What are you trying to tell me? David whispered. The entity didn't answer. But for the first time, David noticed something new. Around it, the stars seemed to shimmer slightly, like heat distortion on a summer road. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. He pulled out his tablet and made a note. Possible visual distortion in space surrounding entity. Check for gravitational lensing effects. Then he went to find Peter. They had 3 days to find evidence, and David intended to use every second of them, because he was increasingly certain of one thing. The white entity was real. It was trying to communicate something, and whatever it was might be more important than any of them realized. Peter met David in the engineering section at 0600 hours, looking like he hadn't slept. The engineer had dark circles under his eyes and his usually neat hair stuck up at odd angles. "I've been running data all night," Peter said, pulling up readings on his workstation. "You were right about the EM anomalies." David's heart rate spiked. "What did you find?" "Look at this." Peter displayed a series of graphs showing electromagnetic spectrum readings. "These spikes occur at the exact times you logged your sightings. They're minor, barely above background radiation, which is why nobody noticed them before. But they're there and they're consistent." "What frequency?" "That's the interesting part. They're in the near ultrasonic range, just above what we'd normally monitor. These frequencies affect human perception. There are studies from old Earth about how certain sound frequencies can cause feelings of unease, visual distortions, even hallucinations." David studied the data, his mind racing. "So you're saying the entity is generating frequencies that make me hallucinate it?" "No, that's not what I'm saying." Peter zoomed in on one particular spike. "If it were causing hallucinations, the effect would be random, chaotic. But you're seeing a consistent form, always the same basic shape, always behaving in logical ways. What I'm saying is that maybe this thing exists in a frequency range that human senses can detect, but our electronic equipment isn't calibrated to measure properly." "That's impossible." "Is it? Humans evolved to sense things that helped us survive. We can detect magnetic fields to a degree. We can sense when we're being watched even when we can't see anyone. What if this entity exists in a range that our instruments pass over as noise, but our brains recognize as something real?" David felt a chill. "The old reports mentioned this. Entities that only appear to direct human observation." "Right. So maybe it's not that you're hallucinating. Maybe everyone else is just blind to it because they're relying on instruments instead of their own senses." Before David could respond, his communicator chirped. Dr. Grant's voice came through, terse and professional. "Walsh, report to medical bay immediately." David exchanged a glance with Peter. "On my way, Doctor." The walk to the medical bay felt like a march to execution. David knew what this was about. Reynolds must have decided to ground him, and Dr. Grant would be the one to deliver the news and probably sedate him for good measure. But when he entered the medical bay, he found not just Dr. Grant, but Captain Reynolds and 3 other crew members he didn't know well. Officer Harris from Navigation, Technician Liu from Life Support, and Specialist Barnes from the Mining Operations Team. "Sit down." "Walsh," Captain Reynolds said. David sat, his stomach nodding. This was worse than he'd thought. They had assembled witnesses. "Officer Harris," Reynolds said, "tell Walsh what you told me this morning." Harris, a slim woman in her 30s, looked uncomfortable. "I saw something last night. During my shift in navigation, I was checking our position relative to the asteroid field and I saw something outside." David's breath caught. "What did you see?" "I don't know. It was pale, glowing, only there for a few seconds, but it looked like a person floating in space. I thought I was seeing things, so I didn't report it." "Technician Liu," Reynolds continued. Liu, a young man barely out of his training period, nodded. "Same thing. 2 nights ago I was doing maintenance in the water reclamation area. I saw something through the port there. Whitish, human-shaped. I figured I was tired and ignored it." David felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. "You saw it too? Both of you?" Specialist Barnes reported a sighting as well, Dr. Grant said. "That's 3 independent witnesses aside from you, Walsh, all describing the same phenomenon." Barnes, a weathered woman who had been mining asteroids for 15 years, spoke up. "I didn't want to say anything because I thought people would think I'd cracked. But yeah, I've seen it. Started about a week ago, always during night cycle, always watching the ship." Captain Reynolds leaned forward. "So either we have 4 crew members experiencing the same psychotic break, which is statistically unlikely, or something is actually out there. Dr. Grant, your assessment?" The doctor looked troubled. "Mass hallucination is possible, but rare. The fact that they're all seeing the same thing at different times and locations suggests either a shared delusion, which would require contact between the observers, or an actual external stimulus." "We haven't talked to each other about this," David said quickly. "I didn't know they'd seen anything until just now." Reynolds nodded. "That's what they all said. 4 independent witnesses describing identical phenomena. Walsh, you've been researching this. What do you think we're dealing with?" David pulled out his tablet, hands trembling slightly. Based on the old reports and the data Peter Zhao found in the EM spectrum, I think we're seeing something that exists in a perceptual range that our instruments aren't designed to detect. It shows up to direct human observation, but not to cameras or sensors. That sounds like science fiction, Barnes muttered. 6 months ago, I would have agreed, David said. But the evidence is there. The EM spikes coincide with sighting times. The pattern of appearances suggests intelligence. And now we have multiple witnesses. What do you recommend, Captain? Dr. Grant asked. Reynolds was quiet for a moment, her face unreadable. Finally, she spoke. I'm authorizing a Level 3 investigation. Walsh, you're in charge. You'll work with Zhao to gather as much data as possible. Harris, Liu, Barnes. You'll document any additional sightings immediately. I want times, locations, descriptions, everything. We have 3 weeks until the next supply ship arrives. If this is something dangerous, I need to know before we have additional crew coming aboard. And if it's not dangerous, David asked, then we document it, report it to Colonial Space Command, and let the scientists figure out what it is. But Walsh, I'm trusting you on this. Don't make me regret it. Yes, Captain, the meeting adjourned. As David left the medical bay, Harris caught up with him. Walsh, can I ask you something? Of course. When you see it, do you ever feel like it's trying to communicate? David stopped walking. Yes, every time. Like it wants to tell us something but doesn't know how. Harris nodded slowly. That's what I thought too. It's not threatening. It's more like it's curious, or maybe lost. Over the next 2 days, David coordinated with Peter and the other witnesses. They set up observation stations at different points around the ship, covering maximum visibility. The entity appeared like clockwork at 02:30 each night, and now they could track its movements more accurately. The pattern became clear. It was circling the habitation modules, avoiding the cargo bays and engine sections. It seemed most interested in areas where crew members spent time, the mess hall, the recreational areas, the sleeping quarters. It's studying us, Peter observed on the second night as they watched it from the observation port near the gym, like an anthropologist observing a primitive culture. Or like it's looking for something specific, David added. On the third night, David was alone in the communication station during his regular shift. The entity appeared closer than ever before, less than 10 meters from the window. This close, he could see details he'd missed before. The smooth surface of its body wasn't entirely featureless. There were subtle variations, patterns that might have been markings or might have been artifacts of its glow. David had a sudden, reckless impulse. He stood and walked to the window, pressing both palms against the cold glass. The entity remained motionless for a moment, then slowly drifted closer. It raised its own hands, matching David's gesture, separated by mere centimeters of transparent aluminum in the vacuum of space. That's when it happened. A sensation flooded through David's mind, so overwhelming that his knees buckled. Images cascaded through his consciousness, vast cities of light floating in space without any visible support, beings made of pure energy dancing through the void, stars being born and dying in accelerated time, and loneliness, crushing, eternal loneliness that stretched across millions of years. David gasped, stumbling backward. The connection broke. The entity remained at the window for a moment longer, then retreated into the darkness. He sat on the floor, breathing hard, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. It hadn't been communication in any conventional sense. It had been more like a download, a transmission of pure concept and emotion. His communicator chirped. Walsh, this is the bridge. Your vitals just spiked. Are you okay? David realized he was shaking. I'm fine, just give me a minute. Do you need Dr. Grant? No, I'm okay. He pulled himself to his feet and returned to his station. His hands trembled as he began typing a log entry. What he had just experienced was important. Maybe the most important thing that had ever happened to him. The entity hadn't just been observing. It had tried to make contact, and in that moment of connection, David had understood something crucial. The entity was alone, had been alone for an incomprehensible length of time. It had found the horizon's edge by accident, drawn by something in human consciousness that it recognized. It was desperate to communicate, to connect with something living after eons of solitude. But there was something else in those transmitted images. Something dark and hungry moving through space, a presence that consumed not matter or energy but consciousness itself. The entity had been fleeing from it, hiding from it. for longer than human civilization had existed. And that thing, whatever it was coming this way. David's fingers flew across his keyboard, documenting everything. He needed to tell Captain Reynolds. He needed to warn the crew, because the white entity outside their ship wasn't a threat. It was trying to warn them. Captain Reynolds listened to David's report in her ready room, her expression growing darker with each word. Peter stood beside David, having helped him compile the data into something coherent. The EM readings, the sighting logs, the pattern analysis, and now David's account of the mental contact. "You're telling me this entity uploaded information directly into your brain," Reynolds said flatly. "Not uploaded, more like shared. I experienced what it was experiencing. Concepts, emotions, memories. Captain, it's been alone for millions of years, and it's terrified of something. The predator you mentioned? Yes, something that hunts consciousness. It doesn't register on any of our sensors because it doesn't interact with normal matter. It exists in the spaces between dimensions and it feeds on minds." Reynolds rubbed her temples. "Walsh, do you understand how this sounds? I know it sounds insane, but the entity showed me this thing. I saw it consuming entire civilizations, species that existed before humanity, before Earth itself. This thing has been moving through the galaxy for aeons following the spread of conscious life. And it's coming here. The entity believes so. Our expansion into deep space, the number of human minds out here, we're like a beacon to this predator." Peter spoke up. "Captain, even if we're skeptical about the telepathic contact, the data doesn't lie. There's something out there that 4 crew members can see, and that's generating measurable EM anomalies. We should at least be prepared for the possibility that David's right." Reynolds stood and paced to her window, looking out at the asteroid field. "If I report this to Space Command, they'll think we've all lost our minds. They'll send a ship to evacuate us and scrap this mission. Or they'll ignore it entirely," David said. "I found records of similar warnings from other ships. They were all dismissed as psychological incidents. What if those crews were right? What if this predator has been picking off deep space vessels one by one, and we just classified it as accidents or equipment failures?" The captain turned back to face them. "Assuming you're right, what do we do? How do we fight something we can't see or detect?" "I don't know, but the entity does. It's been evading this thing for millions of years. Maybe if I can establish better communication with it." An alarm klaxon cut through the air. The ship's emergency lighting flickered on, bathing everything in red. Reynolds' communicator erupted with voices talking over each other. "Captain, we've got a massive gravitational anomaly approaching. All sensors are reading distortion, but we can't get a visual. Something huge just appeared on long range. Wait, it's gone. No, it's back. The readings don't make sense." Reynolds ran for the bridge with David and Peter close behind. They burst through the doors to find controlled chaos. Every crew member was at their station, fingers flying across keyboards, voices calling out readings and status reports. "Report," Reynolds barked. Navigation Officer Harris looked up, her face pale. "We detected a massive gravitational distortion about 2 hours away at current speed. It's not a ship, not an asteroid, not anything we can identify. It's just a hole in space that's moving. Moving toward us? Unclear. The distortion keeps phasing in and out. But Captain, whatever it is, it's enormous. The gravitational effect suggests something the size of a small moon." David's blood ran cold. "It's here. The predator found us." "We don't know that," Reynolds snapped. But David could see the doubt in her eyes. The ship shuddered violently. Lights flickered across the bridge. An ensign called out, "We're experiencing some kind of interference. Communication systems are failing." David ran to his station and pulled up the diagnostics. "It's not interference. The systems are being shut down. Something is actively disabling our electronics." Peter was already at the engineering console. "Main power is fluctuating. Backup generators are kicking in, but they're struggling. Another shudder, harder this time. The main lights died completely, leaving only emergency lighting. Half the console displays went dark. Get those systems back online," Reynolds ordered. "I'm trying." Peter's hands moved frantically across his board. "It's like something is draining power directly from the grid. This isn't possible." David felt it then. A pressure building in his head. Around the bridge, crew members gasped and clutched their temples. Harris cried out and fell from her chair. Barnes staggered against a console. "What's happening to them?" Reynolds demanded. "It's in their minds," David managed through the growing pressure in his skull. "The predator. It's here. The view screen, still functioning on backup power, showed nothing but empty space and stars. But David knew better now. He ran to the nearest observation port and looked out. What he saw made his heart stop. The space around the ship was wrong. Reality itself seemed to be bending, folding in on itself like a piece of paper being crumpled. And in the center of that distortion was darkness. Not the darkness of space, but something deeper, an absence so profound it hurt to look at. "Captain, I can see it," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's right on top of us." "I don't see anything," Reynolds said, joining him at the port. "You won't. Not with your eyes, not with sensors." "But it's there." More crew members collapsed. Dr. Grant's voice came over the still-functioning intercom, panicked. "Medical emergency on all decks. People are experiencing seizures, hallucinations, some kind of mass neurological event." The white entity appeared suddenly, materializing between the ship and the darkness. Its glow seemed brighter now, more intense. David could feel its presence in his mind, not invasive like the predator, but urgent, desperate. Images flooded his consciousness again. The entity was showing him something, explaining in the only way it could. The predator fed on consciousness by disrupting the electrical patterns of thought. It couldn't affect electronics directly because they lacked awareness, but it could drain power sources and disable systems. The only defense was to break the connection between the electrical and the conscious, to operate without reliance on electronic systems. "We have to go analog," David said, turning to Reynolds. "Everything. No electronics, no computers, nothing with a power source. Pure mechanical systems." "That's impossible," Peter said. "This ship can't function without electronics." "Then we don't function, we act." "Captain, we need to use the mining charges. Set them manually, use mechanical timers, and detonate them to create thrust. We can push the ship out of the Predator's range." "That's insane," Reynolds said, but she was already moving. "Even if we could rig something like that, we'd have no way to aim, no way to control our trajectory." "I'll guide you," David said. The words came out before he fully understood them. "The entity showed me how. I can sense where the Predator is, where it's moving. I can tell you when to fire each charge." "David, you're asking me to trust your psychic connection to an alien entity to manually pilot a mining ship through space using explosives," Reynolds said. "Yes." The captain looked around at her crew, many of them on the floor, writhing as the Predator invaded their minds. She looked at the dark consoles, the failing systems, the chaos of her dying ship. Then she looked at David. "Engineering, this is Reynolds. Shut down main power. Everything. Emergency lighting only, no computers, no navigation. We're going manual. Peter, get to the cargo bay and start rigging mining charges with mechanical timers. Harris, if you can stand, I need you to manually calculate our trajectory options. Everyone else, protect yourselves and stay conscious as long as you can." The orders went out. Peter ran for engineering. David stayed at the observation port, his mind linked tenuously with the white entity. Through its perception, he could sense the Predator, could feel the way it moved through folded space, could anticipate where it would be. The main power died. The ship went dark except for dim emergency lights powered by simple chemical batteries. The Predator's assault on their minds weakened immediately. People gasped, sucking in air like they'd been drowning. "It's working." Dr. Grant's voice came through on a simple mechanical intercom system. "Without electronic systems running, it can't maintain its hold on us." Peter's voice crackled through next. "Captain, I'm at the cargo bay. I've got 20 mining charges. These things are designed to crack asteroids. If we're not careful, we'll crack ourselves. Can you rig mechanical timers?" "Already doing it. But I need coordinates. Where do we aim these things?" David closed his eyes, feeling through the entity's senses. "First charge needs to fire from port side, section 4. 10-second delay. That'll push us 30 degrees starboard." "You heard him, Peter," Reynolds said. "Make it happen." The next hour was a blur of coordinated chaos. David called out firing solutions based on his sense of the Predator's position. Peter and a team of engineers manually placed charges on the hull, using mechanical timers and simple detonators that required no electronics. Harris calculated their trajectory on paper using centuries-old navigation equations. The first charge detonated. The ship lurched violently, throwing people against walls. But they moved, pushed by the force of the explosion in exactly the direction David had predicted. "It's working," Reynolds shouted. "Next charge!" They fired again, and again. Each explosion pushed them further from the Predator's influence. David felt the entity's approval, its desperate hope that they might actually escape. But between the ship and safety, the Predator moved. David sensed it shifting, adjusting, trying to cut off their escape route. "It's adapting," he called out. "We need a bigger push. Captain, we have to fire multiple charges simultaneously." "That could tear the ship apart," Peter warned through the intercom. "If we don't, that thing will tear our minds apart." "Do it." Reynolds made the decision in a heartbeat. "Peter, rig 4 charges. Fire them together on my mark." David watched through the entity's senses as the Predator closed in. The white figure hung between them in the darkness, its glow pulsing. David understood with sudden clarity what was about to happen. "No," he whispered. "Don't." But the entity had already made its choice. As the 4 charges detonated simultaneously, pushing the horizon's edge with violent force away from the Predator, the white entity moved in the opposite direction. It threw itself at the darkness, its glow flaring blindingly bright. David felt the entity's final moments in his mind. The Predator, distracted by the sudden source of concentrated consciousness, turned its attention from the ship to this easier prey. The entity didn't try to flee. It simply held position, drawing the Predator away, sacrificing itself to buy the horizon's edge the seconds it needed to escape. Then the connection broke. The entity was gone, consumed by the darkness. David collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the loss. The ship shuddered again as they rocketed away from the Predator, their trajectory wild but moving them to safety. Behind them, the gravitational distortion began to fade as the Predator, sated for the moment, retreated into whatever dimension it called home. On the bridge, Captain Reynolds pulled herself to her feet. "Status report. Is anyone still conscious?" Voices responded weakly from around the ship. They were alive. Damaged, traumatized, but alive. "Walsh," Reynolds said softly, kneeling beside David. "Is it gone?" "Yes," David managed. "Both of them." The captain rested a hand on his shoulder. They sat in the darkness of the emergency lighting, the ship coasting through space on momentum alone, and mourned the sacrifice of something none of them had even believed in until hours ago. The horizon's edge drifted through space like a wounded animal. Without main power, without navigation, they moved on ballistic trajectory alone. It took Peter's engineering team 3 days to restore enough of the ship's systems to regain basic control. During that time, they lived in near darkness, rationing water and air, hoping their momentum would carry them clear of the Predator's hunting grounds. David spent those 3 days in his quarters writing. He documented everything in longhand on paper, knowing that electronic files might be corrupted or dismissed. Every detail of the entity's appearances, the pattern it had followed, the communication they had shared, and the warning it had given them. He wrote about the Predator, about the way it moved through dimensions humans couldn't perceive, feeding on consciousness itself. When the power finally came back online, Captain Reynolds called an all-hands meeting in the mess hall. The entire crew of 43 gathered, many still showing signs of their ordeal. Harris had a bandage on her temple where she'd hit her head during the attack. Lou's hands trembled as he held his coffee. Barnes looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 days. Reynolds stood before them, her uniform rumpled, her face haggard. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. What we experienced was real, all of it. The entity, the Predator, all of it. I've sent an encrypted message to Colonial Space Command with our full report. I expect they'll be skeptical, but the evidence is there in our logs, our testimony, and the damage to our systems." She paused, looking around at her crew. "Walsh, would you stand up, please?" David rose, feeling everyone's eyes on him. Officer Walsh insisted something was real when we all thought he was losing his mind. He documented it, investigated it, and ultimately, his connection to that entity saved all our lives. Without his guidance, we never would have escaped. Reynolds nodded to him. "Thank you." The crew broke into applause. It was tired, subdued, but genuine. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. Over the next weeks, they limped toward the nearest relay station. The ship was functional, but barely. Half their mining equipment was destroyed from the makeshift rocket maneuvers. Several crew members were still recovering from the psychological trauma of the Predator's assault. David monitored the communications array obsessively, waiting for the response from Space Command. When it finally came, 7 weeks after the incident, he was almost afraid to read it. The message was terse. "Report received. Stand by for further instructions. Survey team being dispatched to your coordinates." That was it. No acknowledgement, no validation, no guidance. Just bureaucratic efficiency. But 3 days later, a second message arrived on a different, more secure channel. It was addressed specifically to David. Officer Walsh, this is Dr. Patricia Fields from the Xenological Research Division. Your report has been flagged for immediate review. What you've described matches patterns we've been tracking for the past 15 years. You are not alone. Multiple deep space vessels have reported similar phenomena. We need to talk securely. Stand by for encrypted channel protocol. David read the message 3 times, hardly believing it. They knew. Someone in the vast bureaucracy of human space exploration knew that these things were real, had been tracking them, and now wanted to talk to him. The encrypted call came through 2 hours later. Dr. Fields was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Officer Walsh, I've read your report 6 times. I need you to understand something. What you experienced, what you witnessed, it's part of a pattern we've been trying to understand for years. Deep space vessels encounter entities we call observers. They appear to solo witnesses, they don't register on electronic equipment, and they seem to be trying to communicate warnings. About the Predator, David said. About multiple threats. The one you encountered is the most dangerous we've documented, but there are others. Space is not empty, Officer Walsh. It's full of things that exist in frequencies and dimensions we're only beginning to understand. Humanity has been incredibly lucky so far, but our luck is running out. Why hasn't this been made public? Because panic serves no one. But you're right that we need to change our approach. Your captain's recommendation for analog backup systems is sound. We're implementing similar protocols across the deep space fleet. We're also establishing an observer corps. What's that? People like you? People who can perceive these entities, who can sense them when instruments fail. You have a gift, Walsh, whether you wanted it or not. That contact you made with the entity, it changed you. You can perceive things now that most humans can't. David thought about that. It was true that since the incident, he'd been more aware of subtle things. The way light bent around certain stars. The feeling of wrongness when they passed through specific regions of space. He'd thought it was just trauma, but maybe it was something more. What are you asking me to do? Come work for us. Help us train other observers. Help us understand these entities and the threats they're warning us about. What happened to your ship could happen to any vessel out here. We need people who can sense danger before the instruments fail. David looked around his small quarters on the horizon's edge. He thought about the white entity, about its sacrifice, about the vast loneliness it had endured. It had given everything to warn them, to save them. I'll do it, he said. On one condition. Name it. We don't just treat these entities as tools or threats. We try to understand them, to communicate with them properly. The one that saved us, it had been alone for millions of years. There are probably others out there, remnants of ancient civilizations trying to survive in the spaces between. They deserve better than to just be classified and studied. Dr. Fields smiled slightly. Agreed. Welcome to the Observer Corps, Officer Walsh. The call ended. David sat back, feeling the weight of what he'd just committed to. His career as a simple communications officer was over. Whatever came next would be stranger, more dangerous, and infinitely more important. 3 months later, the Horizon's Edge docked at Orbital Station Kepler. David said goodbye to his crew, to Peter, to Captain Reynolds. They'd been through something together that bonded them permanently, a shared experience that would mark them all for the rest of their lives. As he boarded the transport that would take him to the Xenological Research Division's headquarters, David paused at an observation port. For just a moment, he thought he saw something in the darkness, a flicker of pale light barely visible, watching the station with what might have been curiosity. He smiled and raised his hand in a small wave. Whether the gesture was seen or understood, he'd never know. But it felt right. Space was not empty. It was full of wonders and horrors in equal measure. Humanity had been stumbling through it blind, relying on instruments that could only detect a fraction of what existed. But now they were learning. Slowly, carefully, they were opening their eyes to the true nature of the universe. David's last thought as the transport pulled away from the station was of the white entity. It had been alone for aeons, and in its final moments it had found purpose. It had saved them. And in doing so, it had changed humanity's understanding of everything. The stars stretched endlessly before him, and for the first time, David Walsh didn't see them as distant points of light. He saw them as they truly were, a vast ocean teeming with life and consciousness in forms humans were only beginning to understand. And somewhere out there in the spaces between the stars, other entities watched and waited. Some were warning, some were hunting, and some, like the one that had saved his ship, were simply hoping to find connection in the infinite loneliness of the void. David's work was just beginning. Humanity's true journey into deep space had only just started, and now they would face it with their eyes open, trusting not just their instruments but their own senses, their own instincts, their own ability to perceive the impossible. The white entity had taught them that lesson at the cost of its existence. David would make sure that sacrifice meant something. He would teach others to see what he could see, to trust what they observed even when machines said otherwise. Because in the end, humanity's greatest strength had never been their technology. It had been their adaptability, their courage, and their ability to trust their own eyes even when faced with the impossible. The transport accelerated toward the jump point. Behind them, the horizon's edge began its long journey home, carrying a crew forever changed by what they had witnessed. And in the darkness of space, unseen by instruments but perhaps sensed by those who knew how to look, the universe continued its ancient dance of predators and prey, of watchers and watched, of consciousness reaching out across the void seeking connection in an existence that was far stranger and more wonderful than any human had dared to imagine.